I think that these are things that we really have to be aware of, like how much our desire to survive influences the way that we are with other people. Hi, I'm Juniper Cameron, and welcome to another episode of Small Transformations. This week, I wasn't entirely sure what to talk about. Do I say that like every single time? I feel like I say that every single time. Just as like a heads up for all of you, I am in the midst of a big move, and I am also getting like a bunch of medical testing done, so I'm a little bit like fried. I have this document where I keep ideas for videos for days like these, and I'm like, what am I gonna talk about? But I want to get a video out to you guys, so I had this idea of one where I kind of wanted to like break down like a video. It's actually a clip from a documentary about like essentially about baby boomers and what life was like in the 60s. It's actually a really incredible series. I haven't even watched the whole thing, but I was completely captivated by it, and it really is incredible to watch and to look back on what was happening in these major movements of the 60s and how it seems like so little has changed in some ways, even though I know a lot has changed. It's really interesting to look back. There was this clip of this woman who was talking about liberals who would, talk about their values and stuff, and she was basically feeling like I guess she was feeling like fed up, like what the hell, liberals, like you need to be, actually putting your values into action, and with just this utter exhaustion with people who talk about something and then don't actually back it up with any action.
It's not going to be pretty. And all these damn liberals, I had grown up with liberals, watching liberals say, well, we're opposed to the war. Well, put your money where your mouth, do something. And they wouldn't. So we had to.
It was so funny to watch that, because I'm like, yeah, like that's exactly what's going on now. People are fed up with liberals who talk about their values, and yet when it comes right down to it, their actions tell a different story. Anyways, it's a really fascinating watch. I highly recommend checking it out. But there was one little clip in particular from another movie that's from like the 1950s. For those who aren't aware, during the 1950s there was like a lot of kind of government funded propaganda, essentially, and I'm calling it propaganda intentionally because it talks a lot about like what the right ways to behave are. It talks about how to be a good wife, how to be a good daughter, how to be a good son, how to be a good man, like all of this stuff, like really trying to strictly enforce these like gender roles. The other day I was actually like, there was this stream of events that led me to this like Russian communist propaganda movie. I didn't watch the whole thing, just a little clip. I was on Etsy, stumbled upon an antique page, and I found this antique milk and cream separator, which I had never heard of. So I was looking on YouTube to see a video of how they work and what they look like, and I found this clip from a Russian communist propaganda movie that was about this like farm girl whose dad passed away and like left her some like little inheritance, but like it wasn't really enough to get her started, so she goes to this like farmer who like refuses to help her out, and the story basically goes that she bands up and forms a co-op with other farmers, which sounds like amazing to me, and they like kind of get these, they eventually make enough money to start buying like technology that makes their life around the farm easier, and they prosper. The scene was admittedly pretty creepy to watch. Very different, I guess, film norms of the time. It was pretty weird. Watching it, I kind of like made this connection between that kind of propaganda and this like 1950s propaganda, which is so funny because people talk about communist propaganda like it's this like evil thing that's brainwashing, and yet like how is our media not also propaganda and brainwashing? Anyways, so I wanted to kind of take a look at this clip and kind of give a like response to it, because it brought up a lot of thoughts for me about emotional labor and relationship expectations. Oh, there's a little squirrel, like on top of a chimney. Alright, so I'm gonna watch this video and I'm gonna show a little clip here so that you can watch along, and I'm just gonna kind of give my feedback to this.
The women of this family seem to feel that they owe it to the men of the family to look relaxed, rested, and attractive at dinner time. Brother notices the time and realizes that he must put things in order and clean himself up in time for dinner.
What were the rules? One of them was obey authority. Don't ask questions. In the 60s, millions of young people would renounce that one.
These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. This is the time for pleasant discussion in a thoroughly relaxed mood. They don't pick this time of the day to spring unpleasant surprises on Dad.
Another rule, control your emotions. In the 60s, masses of baby boomers would reverse this one and, quote, let it all hang out.
Oh, I'm so happy. I could be a model or a cover girl.
Hey, what's gotten into that crazy kid's sister?
Oh, Jeff, don't be that way.
Notice how Mother seems to become angry herself because of Jeff's anger. Perhaps she shouldn't, but anger is a violent emotion, and we often see an induction of behavior or spread of emotion to other persons, almost like a contagious disease.
Watching that clip really made me think a lot about how much these attitudes are still incredibly prevalent in society, and how much, we talk about them in community in ways that can be really we talk about emotional labor a lot in queer and radical circles, and I think it's something that's been very greatly overused and used inappropriately. I'm just going to pull up the Wikipedia article and read what it says here. It says, emotional labor is the process of managing feelings and expressions to fulfill the emotional requirements of a job. More specifically, workers are expected to regulate their emotions during interactions with customers, co-workers, and superiors. This includes analysis and decision-making in terms of the expression of emotion, whether actually felt or not, as well as its opposite, the suppression of emotions that are felt but not expressed. And I think this video really highlights how much being a wife is treated as a job. Historically, marriage has been an economic institution, and it actually makes perfect sense that our culture would reflect those things, because we're certainly not out of that. So it's really interesting to look back at a video like this and see, and in this context where yes, in familial relationships, it's kind of treated as a job to raise children, to be a certain way, to compose yourself, to, that whole little snippet where the children need to seem like they are, carefree, and that they're excited to see their dad and that they really missed him, that's expecting emotional labor of children to placate an adult as well. So much of it seems to revolve around men. It's around the mother not upsetting the son, teaching the son that he is allowed to have his angry expression, but that the mother is not. And it's just really interesting to look at that in the context of marriage and family as an economic institution, and how much we're really trying to move away from that. I think, at least in the little subculture that I find myself a part of, people with radical politics, that's something that we're trying to get away from. We're trying to move towards authentic relationships. We're trying to move towards something that's dynamic and healthy, something that's not set in roles and hard, concrete rules. It's something very different from the past that we have come from. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that past, because it hasn't been always that. I think that domestic work has been delegitimized. Child rearing is no joke. I do it myself. Keeping a home is no joke. I don't know if you ever see those videos on YouTube of these people trying out the routines of these famously successful people like Benjamin Franklin or Leonardo da Vinci. I think the intention behind it is to see what is it about this person's schedule or this person's routine that made them such a successful historical figure. And the fact of the matter is, it has probably very little to do with their routine and everything to do with wealth and social power and connections. These men were famous because they weren't homemaking. They could hire people to clean for them. You look at the aristocracy of, ages past, and you wonder, how are these people coming up with beautiful poetry and also finding time to learn about astronomy and learning 5 different languages? Well, they didn't have to do shit for themselves. They had people literally dressing them in the morning, getting them undressed at night. They had people bathing them, doing their hair, doing their makeup. They had people doing literally everything, managing every aspect of their lives. So, like, what does that mean? That means that living and surviving is work. That means that rearing children needs to happen. Children need to be cared for. They need to be watched. They need to be kept safe. Meals need to be cooked. Dishes need to be done. Things need to be clean so that we're not living in squalor. This is real work, and I think historically there was a time when this work was actually valued. And I think that, you know, these divisions of labor had to come out of somewhere, and down the line, one type of work was valued over another. And, you know, the rest is history. So when you look back at these videos of these, you know, people from the 1950s trying to tell housewives how to be and tell children how to be, and how much of it revolves around men, like, I mean, obviously that's like misogyny and patriarchy. It's really interesting to see how much those things influence our world today, how much men do expect women to perform certain roles. Nowhere in that video did it talk about being authentic, or did it talk about working through things. That, you know, it seemed so much to be focused on basically making sure that men are comfortable and that their emotional needs are being met. I kind of wanted to situate this in the context of conversations that happen in politically radical communities about emotional labor, because I know that maybe some of you have seen people talking and complaining about like, oh, like I just had to do so much emotional labor for this person. And then you've probably maybe seen the counters of that, where people are saying like, hey, like stop applying this idea of emotional labor to like your friendships and your relationships. The idea of emotional labor arose within the context of going to work and being expected to perform a certain role, like customer service kind of job. And I think it is interesting to look back at, you know, relationships as these kind of economic relationships. Relationships are about survival. Relationships in the context of capitalism and historically are about economic survival. So like as a wife, as a mother, you were expected to perform certain roles, and looking at those videos you see how incredibly clear. I think it's incredibly valid to talk about emotional labor as like a job expectation within certain relationships, and how much our survival, you know, has been kind of resting on our ability to perform these functions of emotional labor. And that seeps so deep into our bodies and into the way that we interact with others, that, you know, we really act as if our life depended on it. And sometimes we don't feel comfortable being authentic. Sometimes we don't feel comfortable setting boundaries. That can be a really valid thing to be worried about in our relationship. My question moving forward is, how do we talk about emotional labor in ways that are accountable and conducive to having good relationships? If these kinds of relationships, or the way that we've looked at relationships and the way that honestly we have to live into relationships is for survival, whether that's building social connections so that we can be supported by others, whether that is you know, being in a relationship in a certain way to make sure that we get our needs met by somebody else, whether that's making sure that we literally don't lose our jobs. I think that these are things that we really have to be aware of, like how much our desire to survive influences the way that we are with other people. And it might not reflect authenticity. It might not reflect our needs and our boundaries. We still live in a capitalist hellscape, as I like to say. That really is going to influence the way that we can be with each other. So how do we think about things like emotional labor in that context? I don't feel like I have any good answers for this. The work that we are trying to do, you know, collectively now, is to be aware of our programming. I am really moved by a lot of the ancestor work that people are doing, and personally my own interest in things like historical costuming and historical fashion. Understanding the context within which our ancestors lived helps us to better understand ourselves. So if we're coming from a framework of relationships as this economic unit, which they have been for so much of human history, at least, you know, recorded history, where like, you know, practices of having a dowry shows how much relationships really are about economics and it's about connections. How do we go into a world where that's not the case? How do we go into a world of authenticity and of cooperation and of egalitarianism from that context? And I think so much of the work that we are trying to do now to understand ourselves, to speak up for ourselves, to stand in our own power, to not apologize for having needs and for having boundaries, while at the same time being sensitive and receptive to the way that our existing in the world is going to impact other people's existing in the world. Such powerful work to be doing, to be ushering in a world where relationships exist in a very different context than they have before. Emotional labor may just be a part of our lives. And I think to some degree it's something that we're going to have to perform to be able to hold space for each other. What is really the concern is when we feel like that we're maybe being taken advantage of for our emotional labor for other people, that we're holding space for people in a way that doesn't feel good. And I think that's where it's our responsibility to speak up for ourselves. And I think that, you know, emotional labor can come to have this connotation that the person who is, you know, asking or using someone else's emotional labor is like inherently being exploitative, when I don't think that that's the case at all. I think that emotional labor is a really natural part of relationships that are healthy. When we talk about emotional labor, you know, first of all, like, it's probably not a term you should be using with people to, you know, ask for what you need, like, unless you can do it in a way that feels really non-judgmental, I think. If we feel like we're holding more space for someone than someone else is holding for us, we can probably bring that concern to them and say, like, hey, I don't feel like my needs are being met around this. I feel like I'm holding a lot of space for you and I don't feel like it's being reciprocated, and I would really like this from you, like for this relationship to feel mutual. Because that dynamic can be very real and it can fall along gender lines, and that's kind of the world that we're coming from, to expect the realities of the past to just disappear without serious work and intention. You don't really know how much work another person has done, and we have an opportunity to make a kind invitation of someone to figure it out and to learn about it. Whether or not we're the one doing the teaching or we're just sharing resources or, you know, whatever, we have an opportunity to understand relationships in this new way and to offer that to other people who maybe aren't aware of, you know, the space that they're taking up and how that might fall along lines of oppression, like white people taking up way too much space in their relationships with people of color and expecting too much emotional labor because white supremacy is founded in this idea that people of color do labor for white people for free. There's these incredibly unfair dynamics historically that shape the way that people interact on ways that people maybe don't even think about. We just have a lot of work to do around stuff like this, and watching a video like that and seeing how incredibly blatant these beliefs are and how like unapologetic, how much they have been knit into the fabric of society and set as expectations for people, which is, it's kind of funny to think about because this video within a video about, you know, these boomers and these people from the 60s who were basically rebelling against these, and now we know, looking back in history, like, yes, they were rebelling against some of these like overt messages, and yet they were replicating them a lot too. You know, the expectations held of people mimicked the society that they were rebelling against in really huge ways. You know, racism continued to exist, sexism continued to exist. You know, we know that hippie culture was not by any means subverting a lot of the structures that I think are the root of what they were trying to rebel against. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do personally. We have a lot of work to do as a culture to understand, you know, the ways that labor has been exploitative, and to reframe our responsibility within society as something that comes from within and exists within a community, which is going to be really hard to do given the framework that we live in now. It's really hard, I think, when people are having to function within capitalism and having to go to work and having to live in these hierarchies, having to shut off part of themselves and, you know, really suffer the consequences of that just to survive, like literally just to survive. So we've really got our work cut out for us. Today, I would like to leave you with an invitation to either comment down below or, you know, feel free to send me an email if you are on my newsletter, and just let me know what you think about this. What are some ideas you have for how we can kind of start to understand these frameworks of relationships and exploitative labor, and how we can start to shift those within ourselves? And is there ways that we can, you know, kind of start to show up more authentically and really shift cultures even within this like exploitative framework? Some people really don't believe that you can change from within. Some people think that you can. And personally, I think that there's, you know, diversity of tactics that are all valid on their own, and that many different people, many different approaches are necessary to do the work of shifting this world. But I'm really curious what your thoughts are, so please drop a comment. Let me know what you think about this. I would love to hear from you. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a like, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell to be notified every time I make a new video. I have a Patreon that has tiers starting as low as $1 a month, and your patronage supports my ability to make these videos, so thank you so much to my patrons, and thank you for considering patronage. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.